He planned to abandon me at the altar and vanish with his mistress. But he made one fatal mistake. He left behind proof. Proof of his lies. Proof of his crimes. Now the man who swore I'd never survive without him? He's the one begging at my door. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about what happens when a woman stops crying and starts fighting back. The grand ballroom of the Whitmore estate glittered like a scene from a classic Hollywood film. Crystal chandeliers casting prisms of light across marble floors, champagne flutes clinking in perfect rhythm to the string quartet's melody, and the air thick with the scent of imported roses. It was our engagement party, the night Daniel Whitmore had chosen to present me to his world. Old money, power brokers, and socialites who sized me up with practiced smiles that never reached their eyes. I remember the weight of his hand on the small of my back, possessive and proud as he introduced me to yet another investor. "This is Lillian," he'd say, his voice dripping with charm, "my future wife." The way he emphasized my should have been my first warning. From the outside we were the perfect power couple. Daniel, the heir to a financial empire with his sharp suits and sharper wit, and me, Lillian Carter, the rising star in corporate law, polished and poised. But behind closed doors the scales were never balanced. Love, in Daniel's world, was transactional. He adored me when I played my part. When I wore the dresses he selected, attended the events he deemed important, laughed at the right moments in conversations with his associates. At first, I mistook his control for passion, his demands for devotion. I told myself it was just how men like him loved. Intensely, all-consuming. But love shouldn't feel like suffocation. The first crack in our fairy tale appeared 6 months before the wedding. I had been offered a partnership at my firm, a career milestone I'd worked years for. When I shared the news, Daniel's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's great, Lil," he said, swirling his scotch. "But you won't need it after we're married." The words were casual, but the meaning was clear. My ambitions were an afterthought. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse, wondering when I'd started shrinking myself to fit into his life. So I walked down the aisle. The ceremony was everything a society wedding should be. A cathedral draped in orchids, a designer gown that cost more than my first car, cameras flashing as we kissed under a rain of rose petals. I remember the way Daniel's hands trembled as he slid the ring onto my finger, the way his voice cracked during his vows. I thought it was emotion. Now I know it was guilt. Because that night, after the last guest had left and I waited in our honeymoon suite, barefoot in silk pajamas, still giddy from champagne, he never came. His note was short, typed, impersonal. "I can't do this. I'm sorry." No explanation. No goodbye. Just silence. His phone went straight to voicemail. His credit cards were frozen. His penthouse, emptied. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. The grandfather clock in the penthouse foyer ticked through the hollow silence like a metronome counting down the hours of my unraveling. Day 7. 168 hours since Daniel had vanished after our wedding reception, leaving behind nothing but the lingering scent of his cologne on my pillow and a 12-word text that had detonated my reality. The bed where we were supposed to spend our first night as husband and wife remained crisply made, the rose petals I'd scattered now brittle at the edges. At first I'd clung to wild explanations. A kidnapping, an accident, some catastrophic misunderstanding. But by the third morning, when his executive assistant coldly informed me his office had been cleared out, the truth curdled in my stomach like spoiled milk. He'd left deliberately. The prenup his lawyers had insisted upon, the one I'd signed without scrutiny because, "It's just a formality, darling," now mocked me from the safe deposit box. Not a single Whitmore asset would come to me. Not the penthouse, not the cars, not even the damn monogram towels in our bathroom. The humiliation burned hottest in public spaces. At the grocery store, tabloids screamed headlines like, "Billionaire bride left holding bouquet," beside paparazzi shots of me fleeing the church alone. My law firm's partners adopted the strained smiles of people attending a funeral whenever I passed their offices. Even my doorman averted his eyes when handing me my mail. New York City, which had always pulsed with indifferent energy, now felt like a gilded cage where everyone knew my shame. On the 11th night, I dreamt of drowning in our wedding champagne fountain. I woke gasping, the taste of desperation sharp on my tongue, and made my decision. If Daniel thought he could erase me like a typo in his life's manuscript, He'd severely underestimated the woman who'd argued cases before the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. His study door resisted when I turned the knob. Locked. The irony wasn't lost on me. How many nights had I respected this boundary while he lived here? Now I brought a fire poker from the bedroom and shattered the antique keyhole with 3 brutal strikes. The splintering would sounded like bones breaking. Moonlight through the floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the room frozen in time. His mahogany desk still bore the ring from where he'd set his tumbler of Macallan 25. The leather chair remained slightly turned as if he'd just risen to greet me. My fingers trailed across the desktop's cool surface, disturbing a fine layer of dust that made me sneeze. The sound echoed strangely, like the house itself was reacting to my intrusion. The bottom drawer stuck when I pulled. 2 stuck. Kneeling, I spotted the nearly invisible seam along the drawer's interior. A false bottom. My thumbnail pried it up to reveal a compartment containing 3 items. A burner phone, a passport, and the black leather ledger that would become my weapon. The passport fell open to reveal Daniel's photo beside the name Ethan Cross. The expiration date was 5 years in the future. My pulse hammered in my throat. This wasn't a spontaneous escape. He'd had a backup identity prepared for months, maybe years. The burner phone's call log showed just 2 contacts, AM, and a Swiss number. When I pressed call on M, a woman's voicemail answered in accented English. "You've reached Alessia. Leave me something interesting." The ledger's pages crackled as I spread it across the desk. At first glance, the columns of numbers and cryptic notations resembled typical corporate accounting. Then patterns emerged. Every Thursday for 18 months, exactly $950,000 transferred to an entity called Marmont Holdings. Beneath these entries, tiny handwritten notes, VC cleared, or BH diversion. My legal training recognized the hallmarks of money laundering: structured transactions just under reporting thresholds, shell companies with no discernible business purpose. Tucked between pages 43 and 44, the photograph stopped my breath. Daniel stood on a yacht's sun deck, his arms slung around Alessia Moretti's tan shoulders. She wore his Dartmouth-class ring on a chain around her neck, the same ring he'd told me he'd lost golfing last spring. The Mediterranean coastline behind them matched the timestamp. May 15th, 3 days after he'd cancelled our weekend in Napa claiming a merger emergency. But the true gut punch came when I flipped the photo over. Someone, Daniel, Alessia, had scrawled a note in French. L'argent est presque prêt. La Marie sera notre diversion parfaite. The money is almost ready. The bride will be our perfect diversion. The room tilted. I gripped the desk's edge as the pieces slot together with horrifying clarity. Our rushed engagement. His insistence on a massive wedding. The way he'd paraded me before his investors like a trophy. I hadn't been a wife, I'd been camouflage. While high society obsessed over our fairy tale romance, Daniel and Alessia had been bleeding his company dry. A notification timed from the burner phone. A text from the Swiss number. Transfer complete. Initiate phase 2. That's when I noticed the safe behind his Rothko painting. And that's when I started smiling. The study smelled like him. That was the first thing I noticed when I finally forced myself to enter. The lingering traces of his sandalwood cologne mixed with the sharp tang of scotch that had seeped into the leather chairs over years of late-night work sessions. My fingers trembled as they hovered over the keyboard where he'd typed messages to her. The desk where he'd planned my humiliation between sips of 30-year-old Macallan. Every object in this room bore witness to his betrayal, yet remained cruelly unchanged while my world had shattered. I pressed the wine glass against the biometric scanner with more force than necessary, leaving smeared fingerprints across its surface. The safe's electronic lock chirped its approval, the sound absurdly cheerful for what it represented, the final violation of his precious boundaries. The interior revealed stacks of $100 bills bound with currency straps, a second passport, this one listing his occupation as investment consultant, and the USB drive that would become my weapon. When the video loaded, I didn't immediately recognize the hotel room. The camera angle showed a rumpled king bed, half-empty room service plates, and a balcony overlooking what might have been Monaco or Dubai. Then they walked into frame, Daniel's hand sliding possessively down Alessia's back as she laughed at something he'd whispered. She wore his fraternity ring on a chain around her neck, the same one he'd claimed was lost during a sailing trip last summer. My stomach lurched when I saw the date stamp. June 18th. Our 6-month anniversary. The night he'd surprised me with diamond earrings after working late at the office. One more month, Daniel murmured on screen, nuzzling Alessia's throat as she toyed with his hair. Once the wedding circus is over and the last transfers clear, we're gone. Alessia's crimson lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. And your blushing bride? She asked in that melodic Italian accent I'd once found charming when we'd been introduced at a charity gala. Daniel's responding chuckle sent ice through my veins. Lillian's brilliant in court but naive about people. She'll cry to her girlfriends for a few weeks, then bury herself in work. By the time she realizes what's happening, we'll be sipping mojitos on a beach with no extradition treaty. The screen went dark. I realized I'd stopped breathing. For 3 days afterward, I moved through the penthouse like a ghost, the video playing on a loop in my mind. I stopped answering calls, from concerned friends, from my law partners, even from my mother. The wedding dress still hung in its preservation box at the back of my closet, the delicate lace yellowing at the edges like a decaying flower. At night, I'd wake gasping from dreams where I stood at the altar alone while laughter echoed from the pews. The breaking point came on the 4th morning. I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror, a gaunt stranger with hollow eyes and greasy hair tangled from days without proper washing. The woman staring back wasn't the rising star who'd argued before the Supreme Court last year. She wasn't even the blushing bride from those hideous Society magazine spreads. She was a shadow, a victim, and I was done. The scissors made a satisfying snick as I sheared off 12 inches of chestnut hair, the length Daniel had always loved running his fingers through. The dark dye stung my scalp as it erased every trace of the woman he'd wanted me to be. When I emerged from the salon hours later, the autumn wind whispered through my newly cropped black strands, the sensation strangely freeing, like shedding a skin I hadn't realized was suffocating me. Next came the penthouse. I hired movers to box up every trace of him. The monogrammed cufflinks, the absurd collection of rare bourbons, even the Egyptian cotton sheets we'd shared. Let the doorman sell it all for all I cared. My new loft in Tribeca had floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the space in unforgiving light, exposing every flaw in the raw concrete walls. Perfect. No more shadows to hide in. At the office, I shocked my colleagues by requesting the white-collar crime cases no one else wanted. The messy financial disputes involving shell companies and offshore accounts. My paralegal gaped when I turned down a high-profile divorce case. But you're perfect for this, she protested. After what you went through, I silenced her with a look. I'm not here to be someone's cautionary tale. Put me on the Morgenroth embezzlement file instead. The Morgenroth case proved fateful. As I pored over bank records showing how the CFO had funneled millions through Caribbean accounts, patterns leaped out at me, the same patterns I'd seen in Daniel's ledger. Structured deposits just under reporting thresholds. Invoices from non-existent vendors. Suddenly, the USB drive's contents took on new meaning. This wasn't just about personal betrayal. It was about proving I could outmaneuver him at his own game. Tracking down Marcus Whitmore required every investigative trick I'd learned prosecuting racketeering cases. His last known address was a dead end, his office line went unanswered, and the few former colleagues who would speak to me clammed up at his name. Finally, I found him through an old Harvard Law alumni directory, teaching a seminar on financial crimes at Columbia. The man who strode into the faculty lounge bore little resemblance to the clean-cut prosecutor in old newspaper photos. Salt and pepper stubble shaded his jaw, and his wrinkled Oxford shirt hung loose on his frame, as if he'd lost weight recently. Only the sharp blue eyes, so like Daniel's yet devoid of their calculating gleam, marked them as brothers. Lillian Carter, he said without preamble, dumping his battered briefcase on the table between us. I wondered how long it would take you to come looking. His voice held none of Daniel's polished charm, just weary resignation. Let me guess, you want help destroying my brother. I slid the USB drive across the table. I want justice. The difference matters. For 20 minutes, Marcus scrolled through the files in silence, his expression growing grimmer with each document. When he finally looked up, his eyes held something I hadn't seen in months: respect. This is bigger than I thought. He's not just skimming, he's been dismantling the company systematically for years. Marcus tapped a particular spreadsheet. These transfers to the Caymans? That's pension fund money. People's life savings. The revelation hit like a physical blow. All those times Daniel had complained about over-entitled employees. Had he been laying the groundwork to steal from them even then? Marcus was still talking. Need to move carefully. If he gets wind we're looking into this. He won't. My voice surprised me with its steadiness. He thinks I'm still crying into my Chardonnay. A ghost of a smile touched Marcus's lips. What changed? I thought of the hollow-eyed woman in the mirror. I remembered who I was before him. Over the next 6 weeks we built our case in secret. Marcus brought in a forensic accountant who traced Daniel's transactions through 17 countries. I used my corporate contacts to identify 3 former Whitmore executives willing to testify about suspicious fund transfers. Every night I'd return to my austere loft and review the day's findings, the puzzle pieces snapping together with terrifying clarity. Daniel hadn't just left me, he'd been preparing to collapse the entire company in a controlled demolition, leaving thousands jobless while he and Alessia disappeared with 9 figures in stolen assets. Our wedding had been the perfect distraction. Who would question financial maneuvers made during such a public personal milestone? The first media leak came in early November. The Wall Street Journal ran a vague piece about irregularities in Whitmore Capital's offshore holdings. Within hours my phone buzzed with the first blocked number call. I let it go to voicemail. Lillian. Daniel's voice sounded strained, almost unrecognizable. Whatever you think you're doing, stop. You don't understand what's at stake. I deleted the message. The next morning, SEC investigators raided Whitmore headquarters. By afternoon the stock had plunged 40%. That's when the real calls started, dozens of them from numbers I hadn't seen in months. His lawyer. His mother. His golf buddy who chaired the Federal Reserve's Oversight Committee. I ignored them all. Until he showed up at my office. My assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. Miss Carter, Mr. Whitmore is insisting. Let him wait, I said coolly, taking my time finishing the motion I was drafting. Let him sweat in that uncomfortable reception chair. Let him stare at the headlines framed on my wall. Carter wins landmark fraud case. And wonder when I'd become someone he couldn't manipulate. When I finally emerged, the man pacing my lobby barely resembled the golden boy who'd charmed Manhattan society. Deep grooves bracketed his mouth, and his usually immaculate hair stood in disarray. At the sight of me, he froze, taking in my sharp black suit, my cropped hair, the unflinching stare that had made opposing attorneys blanch. Lillian. His voice cracked. We need to talk. I adjusted the cuff of my sleeve, noting with satisfaction how his gaze tracked the movement, the way it always had when he was nervous. The time for talking passed when you fled our wedding with a mistress and a stolen fortune. His hand shot out to grab my wrist. You have no idea what you're messing with. Alessia's family is about to be indicted right alongside you. I shook him off. Did you really think I wouldn't find the connection to the Moretti cartel? Those vineyards of hers move more than Pinot Grigio. The blood drained from his face. In that moment I saw it, real fear. Not just for his freedom but for his life. The Morettis weren't people you failed without consequences. Please. The word was a whisper. I can explain everything. I turned toward my office, throwing my final words over my shoulder. Save it for the grand jury. The elevator doors closed on his ashen face. That night I stood at my loft's windows watching the sunset paint the Hudson River gold. For the first time in months the tightness in my chest had eased. This wasn't just revenge, it was reclamation. Of my dignity, my career, my very identity. And the game was just beginning. The first call came at 2:37 a.m., my phone vibrating across the nightstand with such urgency it nearly toppled to the floor. The screen flashed unknown number in bold white letters, the harsh light cutting through the darkness of my bedroom. I let it ring out, the silence afterward somehow louder than the shrill tone. 3 minutes later it rang again. And again. By dawn my lock screen showed 42 missed calls, each one a silent scream of desperation. I didn't need to check the voicemails to know who it was. The frantic rhythm of the calls told me everything. Daniel wasn't just reaching out. He was drowning. The SEC's freeze on Whitmore Capital's assets had hit the morning news like a financial tsunami. CNBC's ticker scrolled endless red numbers as analysts debated whether this marked the end of one of Wall Street's most storied investment firms. Outside his Fifth Avenue offices, cameras caught employees carrying cardboard boxes to waiting Ubers, their faces drawn with the stunned expressions of people who'd just learned their 401k had evaporated overnight. But the most damning footage came from Monaco, grainy cell phone video of Alessia Moretti boarding a private jet with two hulking bodyguards, her normally impeccable blonde hair hidden under a baseball cap, her Louis Vuitton carry-on no doubt stuffed with whatever cash she'd managed to grab before the accounts froze. She hadn't even looked back. I was in my home office reviewing Marcus's latest files when the pounding started at my front door. Not the polite rap of a delivery person or the cheerful staccato of a visiting friend. This was the kind of violent hammering that made my deadbolt rattle in its housing. Through the peephole I saw a version of Daniel I'd never witnessed before. His Brioni shirt, always crisp and monogrammed at the cuffs, was wrinkled and missing two buttons as if he'd been tearing at it in frustration. The shadow of 3 days' stubble darkened his jawline, and his eyes had the wild, unfocused look of a man who'd been drinking to stay sober. When I opened the door just enough to speak through the chain, the smell of bourbon and stale sweat rolled over me in a nauseating wave. "You look like hell," I said, my voice flat. His bloodshot eyes locked onto mine with terrifying intensity. "They're going to indict me before the week's out." The words came out hoarse, his vocal cords shredded from what I imagined had been hours of shouting, at lawyers, at accountants, probably at Alessia's voicemail. "I need you to testify that you authorized the Cayman transfers last quarter." I barked out a laugh so sharp it made him flinch. "You want me to commit perjury? To save you?" My fingers tightened around the doorframe. "After everything?" A muscle twitched in his jaw. "Name your price. The penthouse. The Hamptons property. Whatever's left in the... I don't want your damn houses." The vehemence in my voice startled us both. I took a steadying breath, lowering my tone to something more dangerous. "You still don't get it, do you? This was never about money." For the first time something like fear flickered behind his eyes. "Then what?" Stepping back, I reached for the manila envelope on my entryway table and slid out a single sheet of paper. The color drained from Daniel's face as he recognized his own handwriting. The meticulous notes from his ledger detailing which shell companies were fronts for Moretti family money laundering. "Marcus has copies of everything," I said calmly. "The offshore accounts. The falsified audit reports. Even those charming texts between you and Alessia discussing how my usefulness would expire after the wedding." I tilted my head. "Did you know racketeering convictions carry 20-year minimums?" His hand shot out to brace against the door jamb, the knuckles whitening. "You wouldn't." I smiled then, slow and cold, watching the realization dawn in his eyes, that the woman he'd dismissed as predictable had outmaneuvered him at every turn. "The hearing's at 10 tomorrow," I said, starting to close the door. "I'd wear a tie if I were you." The last thing I saw before the deadbolt clicked home was his mouth forming my name, not in anger or even pleading, but with something far more satisfying, the dawning horror of a man who'd finally met someone even more ruthless than himself. The federal courthouse loomed like a monolith of justice, its marble steps worn smooth by decades of desperate footsteps, some entering with hope, others leaving in shackles. I stood at the base of those stairs, my black Saint Laurent heels clicking against stone as reporters swarmed like vultures, their shouted questions blending into a cacophony of noise. "Miss Carter, are you here to testify against your ex-fiancé? Do you feel vindicated? What do you say to claims this is just revenge?" I ignored them all, my gaze locked on the revolving doors ahead. Today wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. Inside, the courtroom hummed with tension. TC investigators huddled with prosecutors, their whispers carrying the weight of billions in lost assets. Journalists scribbled notes, sketching the scene for their afternoon headlines. And then there was him. Daniel sat at the defendant's table, his once impeccable suit now hanging off his frame like he'd shrunk inside it. His lawyer, a high-priced shark from the whitest of white shoe firms, leaned in, murmuring what I could only assume were empty reassurances. But Daniel wasn't listening. His eyes, hollow and bloodshot, found mine the moment I entered. I didn't look away. The bailiff called the court to order, and the hearing began with dry procedural formalities. Then Marcus took the stand. Watching Daniel's brother testify was like seeing a ghost step into the light. Marcus spoke with clinical precision, detailing the labyrinth of shell companies, the doctored financials, the way Daniel had siphoned pension funds into Alessia's offshore accounts. Every word landed like a hammer strike, and with each blow Daniel's carefully constructed facade crumbled further. His hands, usually so steady, trembled visibly on the table. His lawyer objected, loudly, desperately, but the evidence was irrefutable. Then it was my turn. As I walked to the stand, the courtroom fell so silent I could hear the rustle of my skirt against my stockings. The oath slipped from my lips automatically, but my focus was on Daniel. For the first time since I'd known him, he couldn't hold my gaze. He stared at his hands instead, his shoulders hunched like a man already feeling the weight of prison bars. The prosecutor began gently. "Miss Carter, when did you first suspect something was amiss in Mr. Whitmore's business dealings?" I folded my hands in my lap. "When I found a ledger hidden in his study 2 days after he abandoned our wedding." A murmur rippled through the gallery. It contained records of unauthorized transfers to entities later identified as shell companies. "And what did you do with this information?" "I contacted the only person I knew Daniel feared, his brother." Daniel's head snapped up at that, his eyes blazing with betrayal. But what did he expect? That I'd protect him after everything? That loyalty was a one-way street? The prosecutor slid a document toward me, a spreadsheet from the USB drive. "Can you identify this?" "Yes. It's a record of wire transfers Daniel made to an account in the Cayman Islands under the name Marmont Holdings." I pointed to a highlighted entry. "This one, dated the week before our wedding, diverted $3 million from employee retirement funds." A juror gasped. Daniel's lawyer half rose from his seat. "Your Honor, this is overruled." The judge didn't even look up. The prosecutor pressed on. "Did Mr. Whitmore ever discuss these transactions with you?" I met Daniel's gaze then, letting him see the cold truth in mine. "No. But he did discuss his plans to disappear with Alessia Moretti. On video." The gallery erupted. The judge's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "And Daniel?" He looked at me with something I'd never seen before. Not anger, not hatred, but fear. Raw primal fear. Because he finally understood. I wasn't just a scorned woman. I was the architect of his downfall. When I stepped down from the stand, my legs were steady, my breath even. The reporters lunged forward, but I cut through them without a word. Outside, the sunlight hit my face like absolution. The sentencing came 3 months later. 10 years for wire fraud, 5 for embezzlement, another 2 for conspiracy. Alessia, apprehended in Nice trying to board a yacht with a forged passport, got 7. The judge called it one of the most egregious breaches of fiduciary duty he'd ever seen. I watched Daniel be led away in handcuffs, his tailored suit replaced by a prison jumpsuit, his proud head finally bowed. As the marshals escorted him past my row, he paused, just for a second, and whispered a single word, "Why?" I leaned in, close enough that only he could hear. "Because you forgot one thing," I murmured. "I was never just the bride. I was the lawyer who took down Sterling and Grant." His eyes widened. Sterling and Grant, the hedge fund that had collapsed after I exposed their Ponzi scheme 2 years prior. A case Daniel had followed obsessively, calling my victory a fluke. The marshal tugged him forward, but the damage was done. I'd seen the realization dawn in his eyes. He'd underestimated me from the start. The press swarmed as I exited the courthouse. "Miss Carter, do you have any comment for your ex-fiancé?" I adjusted my sunglasses, the cameras flashing like lightning against the lenses. "No," I said simply. "But I do have a message for any woman who's ever been underestimated. The best revenge isn't destruction. It's living well." And with that I walked away, not toward the life Daniel had tried to dictate for me, but toward one I'd built for myself. The first anniversary of Daniel's sentencing dawned bright and clear, the kind of pristine Manhattan morning where the sunlight glinted off skyscrapers like diamonds scattered across concrete. I stood on the balcony of my new Tribeca office, the one I'd leased after founding Carter and Associates, sipping espresso so strong it could strip paint. Below me, the city pulsed with its usual relentless energy. Taxis honking, pedestrians weaving through crosswalks, the distant hum of a street musician's violin. Normalcy. Freedom. The kind of ordinary morning I'd once taken for granted before Daniel Whitmore had turned my life into a cautionary tale. My assistant buzzed in. "Miss Carter, your 10 o'clock is here." I didn't turn from the view. "Which one?" "The SEC investigator about the Moretti case." Pause. "Marcus Whitmore is in the waiting room." That made me turn. Marcus stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his profile silhouetted against the skyline. He'd shed the rumpled prosecutor look. Now he wore a charcoal suit that actually fit, his salt and pepper hair trimmed close. In his hands was a manila folder thick enough to choke a small animal. "You're late," I said by way of greeting. He turned, that half-smile playing at his lips. "Had to stop by the courthouse. Got some news." He tossed the folder onto my desk. It landed with a thud, releasing a puff of paper dust. "Moretti capos started flipping this morning. Turns out Alessia's been skimming from them for years." I didn't touch the file. "How much?" "Enough that they've put a price on her head." His smile faded. "Daniel's too." The espresso turned acidic in my stomach. However much I'd hated him, I hadn't wished him dead. "Will they?" "Witness protection moved him last night." Marcus studied me. "You okay?" I walked to my desk, running a finger along the folder's edge. "Just surprised you'd tell me. Figured you earned the right to know." He hesitated. "There's something else." From his inside pocket he produced a creased photograph. Daniel and Alessia at some beach resort, her laughing as he kissed her shoulder. The date stamp read 2 days before our wedding. Except now I noticed what I'd missed before. The desperation in Daniel's grip on her waist, the way Alessia's smile didn't reach her eyes. 2 predators, each thinking they were playing the other. Marcus tapped the photo. "He reached out last week. Asked me to give you this." "Why?" "Said you'd understand." And I did. This wasn't an apology. It was a confession. Daniel had been as much Alessia's mark as I'd been his. We'd all been pawns in her game. I slid the photo into my desk drawer next to the other relics of that life. "Tell him thanks. Then lose my address." Marcus nodded but didn't leave. Instead he pulled a second envelope from his briefcase. Cream linen, embossed with the Columbia University seal. "One more thing. They want you to teach next semester. White-collar crime seminar." I laughed outright. "You're joking." "Dead serious." That half-smile returned. "Turns out dismantling $1 billion fraud makes you an expert." The phone rang, my investigator with updates on the Moretti case. Marcus turned to go but I caught his wrist. His pulse jumped under my fingers. "Stay," I said. "This one's juicy." For the next hour, we pored over wiretap transcripts and bank records, our heads bent together like co-conspirators. At some point my assistant brought sandwiches. At another, Marcus rolled up his sleeves, revealing the faint scar from where Daniel had pushed him off a dock when they were 12. The story made me laugh so hard I snorted iced tea. When the last document was annotated and the investigator gone, Marcus lingered by the door. Dinner. Not a date. Just dinner. Between colleagues. Between friends. Between 2 people who'd survived the same storm. I grabbed my blazer. "Only if you're buying." We took the stairs instead of the elevator, our footsteps echoing in the concrete stairwell. Outside, the autumn air carried the scent of roasting chestnuts and diesel. Somewhere, a busker played New York State of Mind on a dented saxophone. Marcus nudged me as we walked. "You ever think about leaving? After everything?" I tilted my face to the sun. "And miss all this?" He laughed, and it occurred to me that I liked the sound, warm and unguarded, nothing like his brother's calculated charm. We crossed the street just as the light turned, 2 small figures moving against the tide of pedestrians. Somewhere, Daniel was starting over with a new name and a past he couldn't outrun. Alessia was counting her losses. And I was exactly where I belonged. The end.